These days I find myself in need of music that cheers me, and that of Joseph Haydn rarely fails in that regard. So for the next few weeks I'm going to focus my efforts on some of his string quartets. Haydn occupies a similar historical position with regard to that genre as he does with respect to the symphony. That is, his many champions have hailed him as the father of both. Of course, there were symphonists before Joseph Haydn, and there were also composers who wrote compositions for the same ensemble that Haydn calls for in his string quartets, two violins, a viola, and a cello, treated in a manner that is roughly analogous to that of four-part choral writing with its soprano, alto, tenor, and bass assignments. I don't know how many of Haydn's 60-odd quartets I'll be examining here, so I'm going to start with a late set, the last complete set, in fact, that he composed. The Opus 76 quartets were a response to a commission by a Hungarian count, the commission calling for 6 string quartets. During roughly the entire span of the 18th century, it was standard practice to bring out certain types of music in sets of 6. And we see this in the Concerti Grossi of Corelli, Handel, and Bach, plus the latter's cello suites and violin sonatas and partitas, and then in publication conventions of the latter half of that century with representative sets of quartets by Haydn, Beethoven, and others. In that enumeration, I'm including Beethoven's Opus 18 quartets, which, although published during the first year of the 19th century, just 2 years after the publication of Haydn's Opus 76, are very much representative of practices of the late 1700s. On a personal note, I'll say that I've occasionally listened to and enjoyed these compositions for years, and have often been struck by the obviously high standards of compositional craft in evidence in them, but I've never really dug into them the way I'm going to now. So, as in the case of virtually every other video I've posted to YouTube, I will be the primary beneficiary of these efforts. Of course, it's always nice to have a few companions along for the ride. Haydn's Opus 76 quartets were brought out in print in 1799, a year or so after they were actually composed. That delay had something to do with a dispute over publication rights, that having a familiar ring to it owing to the fact that Haydn wasn't always circumspect in the offers and promises he made to various publishing houses. These are all beautifully composed pieces exhibiting the high pitch of polyphonic craftsmanship that sets Haydn apart from almost every other creative artist of his generation. The first of the series, the G major quartet under review in this video, is an overall good-humored work that could hardly fail to evoke a smile or two from an attentive listener. It takes the standard 4-movement design of the symphonic cycle, and its key relations are typical of the harmonic language of the late 18th century. That language could, of course, be deployed in imaginative and often surprising ways, as when Haydn gives us a final movement set in the parallel minor key. The only other large-scale example of that comes to my mind is Felix Mendelssohn's A major Italian symphony with its A minor finale. I believe it might be best in this case to say a few words about the quartet's 4 movements and then let the music unfold uninterrupted. Here's a quick synopsis. Movement 1 is a sonata form movement in G major. Haydn indicated repeats of both large sections of the movement, but in this recording only the exposition repeat is observed. Following the simplest introductory anacrusis imaginable, the first theme is set forth as though it were a 4-voice fugue, with the cello providing the subject and the answers rising through the ensemble. It isn't really a fugue, however. It just kind of sounds like one. The near-constant motivic development that runs through this movement like a connecting thread is a real marvel, and I'd recommend repeated listenings in order to be able to follow some of that thread's many twists and turns. Movement 2 is a hymn-like movement in C major, the composition's warmer subdominant key. Haydn was one of the pioneers in that hybrid musical form known as sonata rondo, and one can find numerous examples in his symphonies, quartets, piano trios, sonatas, and serenades. There are differences among those many specimens, often subtle, sometimes striking. This one, for instance, behaves more like a sonata-form movement with 2 recapitulations than one with a false exposition repeat, the more usual model. And you'll see that reading in my running commentary. The first theme is a broad-breathed meditative effusion given twice at the movement's beginning in 2 different octaves. You'll want to notice the way these 2 statements differ from each other. Haydn will reverse their order when he brings their return one at a time during the aforementioned recapitulations. The second theme is remarkably pointillistic, and Haydn contrives to end this beautiful movement with half the ensemble's players making use of their lowest open string. Movement 3 returns us to G major, which is standard for works of this period, for a fleet-footed minuet movement marked presto, and therefore sounding for all the world like a Beethoven scherzo. The contrasting trio is a genial-sounding Landler, a great virtuosic solo outpouring for the first violin with pizzicato accompaniment. The most unusual feature of Opus 76 No. 1 is its final movement, which is set in the parallel minor key and follows an analogous harmonic course to that of the first movement of Beethoven's much better known Fifth Symphony, only without a minor key coda. That is, the second theme of this minor key sonata form movement is in the relative major, B flat in this case, during the exposition, but returns during the recap in the parallel major, which brings us home to the tonic with its overall major modality restored. The G major coda is hilarious. In this video, I've furnished a little more harmonic guidance than I have in my treatments of similar music in the past. This takes the form of occasional Roman numeral analyses of interesting chromatic passages. If this doesn't mean anything to you, feel free to ignore it. If it does, I hope you enjoy it. The recording we'll hear is by the Kodály Quartet in a 1989 release by Naxos.
Thank you.